Elias Thorne hated December. He hated the way the sun, already a pale imitation of its summer self, surrendered the sky earlier each day, leaving the world to the mercy of a cold, indifferent moon. He hated the particular bite of the wind as it scoured the high plains of the Montana Territory, a wind that promised blizzards that could bury a man and his regrets under 10 feet of snow. Most of all, he hated the hollow echo of a holiday he had long since abandoned. Christmas was a ghost, a phantom of warmth and family that had no place in the stark, solitary life he had carved for himself. His cabin, built with his own hands from lodgepole pine hewed from the nearby mountains, was a fortress against such sentimentality. It was a structure of pure function, a stone hearth for heat, a bed for rest, a table for his meager meals, and a single chair. There were no decorations, no unnecessary comforts. The only company he kept were the ghosts of his own making, the silent, accusing faces of men he had fought beside in the war, men who had not been fortunate enough to trade their memories for solitude. He had come here to be alone, to let the vast, unforgiving landscape scour him clean of the past. For 5 years, it had almost worked. He stood at the cabin's single window, a small pane of warped glass he had hauled 50 miles from the nearest town, and watched the sky. It was the color of a fresh bruise, a churning mass of gray and purple that threatened to swallow the jagged peaks of the distant Beartooths. A storm was coming, a real one, the kind that howled like a wounded animal and did not stop until it had exhausted its fury. He felt a grim satisfaction. Let it come. A blizzard was an honest danger, a clean threat you could fight with firewood and fortitude, unlike the treacherous landscape of memory. He had enough wood stacked to last a month, salted meat hanging from the rafters, and flour in the bin. His mare and the 2 milk cows were secure in the lean-to barn, their warmth a small pocket of life against the encroaching cold. He was prepared. He was always prepared. It was the one lesson the war had hammered into him until it was part of his very bones. Preparedness was survival. Emotion was a liability. Connection was a weakness. A flicker of movement near the cottonwood grove at the edge of his property snagged his attention. It was nothing. A deer, maybe, or a trick of the failing light. He dismissed it, turning back to the fire, poking the logs until they spat a shower of defiant sparks. But the image lingered. It had not looked like a deer. It had been slower, more deliberate, and then it had vanished. He felt a familiar prickle of irritation. He did not want visitors. He did not want complications. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, his movements stiff with reluctance. His code, the one thing the war had not managed to strip from him, demanded he investigate. A man did not leave another soul to the mercy of a storm like this, no matter how much he might wish them gone. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door, another lesson learned the hard way, and stepped out into the wind. It hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and plastering his beard to his face with ice crystals. The first snowflakes, hard and sharp as bits of glass, were already beginning to fall. He followed the tracks, faint depressions in the thin layer of existing snow that were disappearing almost as quickly as he found them. They were not the tracks of an animal. They were small, stumbling, the prints of someone on foot and exhausted. A fool, then. No one in their right mind would be out here, miles from any town, with a blizzard about to break. He found the source of the tracks slumped against the trunk of a massive cottonwood. It was a woman. Her fine wool coat was torn and covered in snow, her face deathly pale against the dark wood of the tree. One of her hands was bare, clutched around the strap of a small, mud-spattered reticule, as if it were her last link to the world. She was barely conscious, her breath a series of shallow, rattling sighs. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated annoyance. This was exactly the kind of complication he had built his entire life to avoid. A woman. A lost, freezing woman who was about to become his problem. He could turn back. He could pretend he had seen nothing. The snow would cover her, and by morning it would be as if she had never existed. The thought was a cold, hard stone in his gut. He had seen too much death to invite more to his doorstep. His solitude was a choice, not a sentence to be a monster. With a low curse that was whipped away by the wind, he knelt beside her. "Mom." His voice was a rusty croak from disuse. Her eyelids fluttered. Blue eyes, the color of a summer sky, he had almost forgotten, tried to focus on him. They were filled with a terror that was quickly being replaced by a vast, empty exhaustion. She tried to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped. Lost horse. He did not need the whole story. It was written in her inadequate boots, her torn clothing, the desperation clinging to her like the cold. He looked back toward his cabin, its single point of light a fragile beacon in the growing storm. Leaving her here was a death sentence. He knew it, and damn it all, he knew he could not do it. "Hold on," he grunted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of cold limbs and wet wool. As he lifted her, her head fell against his shoulder, a gesture of complete, unconscious trust that sent an unwelcome jolt through him. He turned his back to the wind and began the slow, arduous walk back to the cabin, a reluctant savior carrying a complication that felt heavier with every step. The blizzard closed in behind them, erasing their tracks and sealing them off from the rest of the world. Clara Winter drifted in a sea of cold and confusion. There were fractured images, the terrifying lurch as her horse, Patriot, stumbled and went down, the heart-stopping crack of its leg, the awful, final necessity of leaving him behind. Then, only the walking through an endless, swirling vortex of white, the wind a physical enemy that pushed and clawed at her. She had been fleeing one monster only to be caught in the teeth of another. The light had been a hallucination at first, a cruel trick of her freezing mind, but had grown stronger, a single, golden eye in the storm, and she had stumbled toward it until her legs would carry her no more. Warmth was the first thing she registered as consciousness returned, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be seeping into her very bones. It was centered on her feet, which tingled with a painful intensity. She slowly opened her eyes. The ceiling was made of rough-hewn logs, dark with smoke. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and wet wool. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a thick, heavy blanket that felt like it was woven from horsehair. Her sodden boots and stockings were gone, and her feet were wrapped in warm, dry cloths. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. A figure moved in the periphery of her vision, resolving into the shape of a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a dark, untamed beard and hair that fell past his collar. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, placing another log on the crackling fire in the stone hearth. He was the man from the storm, the one she had vaguely registered before the darkness took her. Her rescuer. He turned and saw she was awake. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, assessed her with an unnerving lack of expression. They were the color of the winter sky just before the snow began to fall. There was no welcome in them, only a kind of weary resignation. "You're alive," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes," she managed, her voice a dry rasp. "Thank you. You saved my life." He gave a short, dismissive nod and turned back to the fire. "There's broth on the hearth. Drink it." Clara pushed herself up, ignoring the spinning in her head. She would not be an invalid. She had not survived the ruin of her family, the betrayal of Alistair Finch, in a Rocky Mountain blizzard only to be treated like a fragile doll. She saw her reticule on the floor by the cot and felt a small measure of relief. Beside it, her wet coat and dress were hung on pegs near the fire, steaming gently. She was still in her chemise and petticoats, a fact that brought a flush of heat to her cheeks. She pulled the rough blanket up to her chin. The man brought a tin cup of broth over, not meeting her eyes. He thrust it toward her. "Drink." She took it, her fingers clumsy. The hot metal was a welcome shock. The broth was thin but intensely savory, and, as she sipped it, she felt strength begin to flow back into her limbs. While she drank, she studied him. He was a wall of a man, built for this harsh land. His hands were calloused and capable, his flannel shirt worn but clean. He exuded an aura of profound solitude, as if he were a natural feature of the landscape, like a rock or a pine tree. He was not pleased to have her here. That much was obvious. "I am Clara Winter," she said, her voice stronger now. "I was traveling to Argent Peak when the storm. My horse went lame." He grunted in response, his attention on a piece of leather he was mending. "Foolish, traveling alone this time of year." Clara's spine stiffened. "I had little choice in the matter." She would not explain herself to him. She would not speak of Alistair, of the suffocating pressure and the flight from Boston, of the fear that had propelled her west. He glanced up, his gray eyes catching hers for a brief moment. He saw the flash of defiance there and seemed to file it away without comment. "The blizzard has set in. You'll be here for a few days, at least," he said it like a jail sentence. "I will not be a burden," she declared, swinging her legs over the side of the cot. The floor was cold against her bare feet. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I will earn my keep." For the first time, a flicker of something other than irritation crossed his face. It might have been surprise. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said, the words clipped. "The kitchen is there." He gestured with his head toward a corner of the single room, where a few shelves held tins and sacks. For the next 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of Elias Thorne's cabin. The wind shrieked and moaned outside, piling snow in great drifts against the door and windows. But inside, a strange and quiet rhythm began to form. Clara, true to her word, refused to be idle. On the first morning, she found his flour and a pitiful lump of sourdough starter, and by midday had produced a passable loaf of bread. The smell of it baking filled the small space, a warm, domestic scent that felt alien and yet deeply comforting. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye as he cleaned his rifle. He had expected hysterics, or helplessness, or demands. He had not expected this quiet, determined competence. She moved around his cabin as if she belonged there, her presence softening the hard edges of his solitude. He found it deeply unsettling. When she served him a plate of beans elevated by a bit of onion and the fresh bread, he ate in silence, the food tasting better than anything he had eaten in 5 years. He felt her gaze on him. "This is a sturdy home, Mr. Thorne." "It keeps the winter out," he replied, not looking up from his plate. "Did you build it yourself?" "I did." She fell silent, but he could feel her observing him, her intelligent eyes taking everything in. He was used to being alone. The silence of his cabin was a familiar comfort. But this new silence, the silence shared with her, was different. It was alive, filled with unspoken questions and a strange, humming tension. He did not like it. It made him feel things he had come here to forget. Later that day, she picked up one of his shirts, which had a long tear in the sleeve. "If you have a needle and thread, I can mend this for you." He gestured to a small wooden box on a shelf. He watched as she expertly stitched the fabric, her fingers moving with a grace and precision that surprised him. She was not some helpless city woman. There was a core of strength to her, a resilience that was as plain as the determined set of her jaw. He had seen that same look on the faces of soldiers who refused to break. The recognition was another unwelcome jolt. He found himself thinking about her past. She said she had little choice but to travel alone. What could drive a woman like her, clearly educated and from a world of refinement, into the heart of a Montana winter by herself? He did not want to know. Knowing would mean caring, and caring was a door he had nailed shut long ago. On the 3rd night, the storm's fury began to abate. The wind still whispered around the eaves, but its violent shrieking had subsided. The fire cast a warm, flickering glow over the cabin. Elias was oiling a harness strap, the familiar task a balm to his restless thoughts. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped in her lap. The silence stretched, thicker than usual. "My father was a professor," she said suddenly, her voice soft. "He loved books more than anything. Our house was filled with them. He used to say a home without books was like a body without a soul." Elias stopped his work, his hands stilling on the leather. He did not ask what had prompted this, but he listened. "He and my mother, they took ill last year. The influenza. It took them both within a week, She stared into the fire, her blue eyes reflecting the flames. After that, everything fell apart. My father was not a practical man. There were debts. A man my father had considered a friend, a Mr. Alastair Finch. He offered to help. The name hung in the air. Elias felt a premonition, a cold certainty that this was the source of the fear he had seen in her eyes. His help came with a price, she continued, her voice hardening. He saw our family's ruin as his opportunity. He wanted to possess everything, including me. When I refused his proposal of marriage, he became insistent. He made it clear that he would not take no for an answer. I realized he saw me as just another acquisition. So I took what little money I had left, and I ran. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. I was on my way to a teaching position in Oregon. I thought if I could just get far enough away, but I think he's still looking for me. I think he will always be looking for me. Elias looked at her, at the quiet dignity that radiated from her even as she confessed her desperation. He saw the ghost of the man she was running from, arrogant, entitled, cruel. And he saw the woman who had defied him. In that moment, the carefully constructed wall around his heart developed a hairline crack. He recognized her story not in its particulars, but in its theme, the loss of a world and the fight to build a new one. He cleared his throat. The war, he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. I was a surgeon. At Gettysburg, he did not need to say more. The name of the battle was a story in itself. He never spoke of it, not to anyone. But looking at her, at the shared vulnerability in her eyes, the words had simply come. He was a doctor trained to save men, and he had spent 3 days wading through a sea of blood, patching up boys who would die anyway, the air thick with the screams of the wounded and the stench of death. I came here after, he said, his voice dropping low, to find a place so quiet I cannot hear them anymore. She did not offer pity or platitudes. She simply nodded, a deep, profound understanding passing between them. In the warm, firelit silence of the cabin, surrounded by the immense, snow-covered wilderness, 2 solitary souls had just confessed their ghosts to one another. The air between them shifted, the tension of strangers replaced by the fragile, tentative beginnings of a bond. He looked at the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair and felt a feeling so foreign he could not name it. It felt dangerously like hope. The days that followed the blizzard were filled with a strange, domestic peace that Elias found both comforting and deeply alarming. The world outside was a pristine canvas of white, the sun brilliant on the endless snow. He and Clara fell into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. He would rise before dawn to clear a path to the barn and tend to the livestock, returning to the cabin to find the coffee pot bubbling on the hearth and the scent of baking biscuits in the air. He found himself watching her. He watched the efficient way she moved about the small space, the way she could turn his bland staples into a savory meal. He watched the concentration on her face as she read from the single book he owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare, her lips sometimes moving silently with the words. He noticed the small things, the way a loose strand of her honey blonde hair would catch the light when she bent over the fire, the quiet strength in her hands as she kneaded dough, the clear, intelligent light in her blue eyes when she looked at him. This woman did not belong here. She belonged in a fine house with polished floors and glass windows, not a rough pine cabin at the edge of nowhere. Yet she fit. She fit in a way that scared him. She was filling the empty spaces in his life, spaces he had not even realized were there. His solitude, once a comforting blanket, now felt like a threadbare sheet, inadequate and cold. He was fighting a war on a new front, not against memory, but against the slow, insidious creep of affection. He was losing. Clara, for her part, was undergoing her own transformation. The initial fear and desperation had receded, replaced by a sense of safety she had not felt in over a year. Elias Thorne was a quiet, brooding man, a man who wrapped his loneliness around him like a shield. But beneath the stoic exterior, she saw a profound kindness. She saw it in the way he had carried her from the storm, in the gentle way he spoke to his mare, in the unspoken respect he showed her by allowing her to share the work of the homestead. She watched him too. She saw the raw power in his shoulders as he swung an axe, splitting firewood with an effortless rhythm. She saw the deep sadness that sometimes clouded his gray eyes when he thought she was not looking, a shadow of the horrors he had confessed. He was a man deeply wounded by the world, yet he had not allowed it to make him cruel. He had simply withdrawn. She found herself wanting to breach those walls, to bring a spark of warmth back into those wintry eyes. The attraction between them was a silent, powerful current running just beneath the surface of their daily lives. It was in the lingering glances across the dinner table, the way their hands would brush when she passed him a cup of coffee, the sudden, sharp awareness of their proximity in the small cabin. One afternoon, she was reaching for the flour sack on high shelf, and he came up behind her to get it for her. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His arm brushed her shoulder, and a jolt went through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled back as if burned, his face a mask of stone, but she had seen the flash of something in his eyes, the same turmoil she felt in her own heart. He began to retreat. His answers to her questions became shorter, his silences longer. He would spend hours in the barn, finding tasks that did not need doing, just to be away from the cabin, away from her. Elias was at war with himself. Clara was a complication, a dangerous, beautiful complication. She made him want things he had no right to want. A home, a partner, a reason to care about the rising of the sun beyond the simple fact of survival. These feelings were a betrayal of the promise he had made to himself, the promise to remain empty, to let the ghosts of the past be his only companions. Love, he thought with a bitter twist in his gut, was just another word for a future casualty. The snow had melted enough for travel. The trail to Argent Peak, the small town nestled in the valley, would be passable. They both knew it. The forced proximity was at an end. The subject hung between them, unspoken. "I'll need to go to town for supplies," he announced one morning, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "You can ride with me. From there, you can find a stagecoach heading west." The words were a bucket of ice water. Clara felt her heart clench. Of course, this was the arrangement. He had saved her, sheltered her. Now it was time for her to leave. It was what she had wanted, to get to Oregon, to start her new life. So why did the thought of leaving this rough cabin and this silent, haunted man feel like another kind of exile? "Yes," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Of course. I need to send a wire to the school in Oregon to let them know I am delayed but safe." "We'll leave in the morning," he said, and quickly turned to leave the cabin, unable to look at her, unable to face the strange, hollow ache that his own words had created in his chest. The ride to Argent Peak was mostly silent. Elias rode his powerful gelding, while Clara sat astride the gentle mare he had provided. The landscape was breathtaking, a world of white and blue, the mountains seeming to claw at the sky. But Clara saw none of it. Her thoughts were a jumble of regret and uncertainty. Leaving felt wrong. Staying was impossible. Argent Peak was little more than a single dusty street, now lined with muddy slush, flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a smithy, and a sheriff's office. As they rode in, a sight at the far end of the street made Clara's blood run cold. I don't know," she stammered, but her eyes were wide with a familiar fear. "It looks like—" Elias dismounted in front of the general store. "Stay here," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll get the supplies." He went inside, but his focus was not on the sacks of flour and coffee. He positioned himself near the front window, watching the hotel. A few minutes later, two men emerged. One was a rough-looking character with a gunslinger's swagger. The man's description, which the local was pointing out vaguely toward the mountains, was unmistakable. A woman, traveling alone, with honey-blonde hair and blue eyes. The well-dressed man's gaze swept the street, and his eyes narrowed with predatory focus when they fell on Clara. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a collector who had just found a prize specimen. Elias's blood turned to ice. This was him. This was Finch, the man from Clara's story, the monster she had fled. He felt a surge of protective fury so intense it shocked him. Finch stopped a few feet away, his gaze flicking over Elias with disdain before settling back on Clara. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and possessive. "What a chase you have led me on. Did you really think you could hide from me in this godforsaken wilderness?" "Alistair," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Leave me alone." "Nonsense. You are overwrought. You will come back with me to Boston, and we will forget this unfortunate little adventure," he said, as if speaking to a recalcitrant child. He took a step forward. Elias moved, a subtle shift that placed him more squarely in Finch's path. His hand rested lightly on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "The lady said to leave her alone," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Finch's eyes narrowed, finally taking in Elias as a genuine obstacle. "And who are you? Some local ruffian she has taken up with? Step aside. This is a private matter." "I don't see anyone private here," Elias countered, his gaze as hard and cold as granite. "I see a lady, and I see a man who isn't listening to her." He looked directly at Finch. "I haven't seen her before today. Found her wandering outside of town, lost. Figured I'd bring her to the sheriff. It was a lie, a thin one, but it was a shield." Finch's face tightened with fury. He was not used to being defied. "She is my fiancée. She is unwell, prone to fanciful notions. She is coming with me." He gestured to the hired gun beside him, who took a menacing step forward. The street had gone quiet. People were watching from doorways and windows. The sheriff, a grizzled man with a thick mustache and weary eyes, stepped out of his office, his gaze taking in the scene. "Everything all right here?" Sheriff Brody asked, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. "Sheriff," Finch said, turning on the charm. "He is not my fiancé, Sheriff, and I will not go anywhere with him." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Well, that sounds plain enough to me. This is a free territory, Mr. Finch. The lady can go where she pleases. I suggest you and your man get back in your fancy carriage and move along." Finch's face was a mask of cold rage. He stared at Elias, his eyes promising retribution. "This is not over," he hissed, before turning on his heel and stalking back toward the hotel, his hired gun following like a shadow. The moment they were gone, Clara's composure crumbled. A shudder ran through her, and she swayed in the saddle. Elias reached up and steadied her, his hand warm and solid on her arm. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He's gone for now." But they both knew it was not over. A man like Finch did not accept defeat. He would be back. Elias's protective lie had bought them time, nothing more. He helped Clara dismount, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. He could feel her trembling. Looking into her wide, fearful eyes, the half-formed plan in his mind solidified into a cold, hard necessity. It was insane. It went against every instinct he had honed over the past 5 years. But the alternative, letting Finch take her, was unthinkable. They stood in the muddy street, the life of the town swirling around them, yet they were locked in their own world of quiet crisis. "He won't stop," Clara whispered, voicing his own thoughts. "He never stops until he gets what he wants." "I know," Elias said, his voice grim. He looked at the sheriff's office, then back at her. The words felt like stones in his throat. "There is one way to protect you from him. Legally." Clara looked at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. "What do you mean?" Elias took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He had faced cannon fire with less trepidation. A man like Finch, he can't force another man's wife to go with him. He can't have her committed or claim guardianship if she has a husband. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes dark with the gravity of his proposal. "Clara, marry me." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. Marry him? This quiet, solitary man who had barely spoken a dozen personal words to her? The proposal was not born of love or affection, but of cold, hard pragmatism. It was a shield, a legal maneuver. And yet, the thought of being bound to this man, of having his protection sent a strange, conflicting wave of relief and hurt through her. "As a business arrangement?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "As a way to keep you safe," he confirmed, his face unreadable. "It'll be a name only. A piece of paper to show the law. When Finch is gone for good, when you're safe, we can have it annulled. You would be free to go to Oregon, to live your life." His words were like a slap. A name only. He was offering her a fortress, but making it clear he would not be sharing the hearth. She thought of the past week, of the shared meals, the quiet understanding that had passed between them, the jolt of awareness when he touched her. Had she imagined it all? Was she nothing more to him than a stray he felt honor-bound to protect? The pride that had carried her across a continent rose up. She lifted her chin, her blue eyes locking with his. "No." Elias was taken aback. He had expected relief, gratitude, perhaps hesitation. He had not expected a flat refusal. "Clara, you will come back. With higher guns, not just words." "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I am grateful for your offer, Mr. Thorne. Truly. But I will not trade one cage for another. I will not live a lie, hiding behind a false marriage. If I am to be your wife," she hesitated, the boldness of her next words terrifying her, "then I will be your wife. In truth, not just a name on a piece of paper. I will share your home, your name, and your life. And you'll share mine." She had laid her terms on the table, her heart pounding in her chest. She was offering him a real partnership, not a sham. It was a gamble, laying her heart bare when he had offered only a contract. She watched his face, searching for any sign of revulsion or acceptance. Elias was stunned into silence. A real marriage. She was not just agreeing to his plan. She was raising the stakes to a level he had not dared to contemplate. She was offering him everything he had run from, everything he told himself he did not deserve. A wife, a partner, a shared life. The ghosts of Gettysburg screamed in his mind, telling him to run, to push her away, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude. But then he looked at her, really looked at her. He saw not a burden, but a woman of incredible strength and courage. He saw the partner he had never allowed himself to imagine. The thought of her leaving, of his cabin returning to its cold, empty silence, was now a far more terrifying prospect than the ghosts. Her condition was not a demand, it was a gift. The chance for a life he had thought was lost to him forever. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took her hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers. "In truth, then," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "A real marriage." A tear escaped her and traced a path down her cold cheek. It was a tear of fear, of relief, of a wild, uncertain hope. He did not pull away. He simply held her hand, a silent vow passing between them. "The sheriff," Elias said, his voice still gruff but with a new undertone of purpose. "He's a justice of the peace. We can do it now, before Finch has time to make another move." Clara nodded, her hand clutching his as if it were a lifeline. Together, they walked into the sheriff's office, leaving the world of strangers behind and stepping into a future neither of them could have imagined just a week ago. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork as they entered. His gaze went from their joined hands to their determined faces. "Trouble's back?" he asked. "We need to prevent it," Elias said simply. "Sheriff, we need you to marry us." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, stroking his mustache. He looked at Clara, his eyes kind. "You sure about this, Miss Winter? This is a binding contract." "I am sure, Sheriff," she replied, her voice clear and strong. Brody nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. He had seen enough of the world to recognize desperation, but he also saw something more in their faces. He saw a chance. "All right, then. My wife can stand as a witness." "Martha," he called, "come in here a minute." A stout, kindly woman with flour on her apron emerged from a back room. The ceremony was short and simple, the words of the law spoken in the sheriff's gruff, steady voice. They stood before him, two strangers bound by a common thread, making vows that felt both monumental and terrifyingly real. When Sheriff Brody got to the end, he cleared his throat. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you man and wife." He paused, a twinkle in his eye. "You may kiss the bride, Thorn. It's the law, after a fashion." Elias turned to Clara. She was his wife. The words echoed in the silent space of his mind. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her face a pale, beautiful question. He hesitated for only a second. Then, he leaned down and gently pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. It was chaste, brief, and yet it sent a shock wave through him. Her lips were soft, trembling slightly. In that single, fleeting moment of contact, the contract became a covenant. The arrangement became a reality. She was no longer Clara Winter, a woman he had rescued. She was Clara Thorn, his wife. The realization settled over him, heavy and profound, and, to his utter astonishment, welcome. The ride back to the homestead was different. The silence was no longer tense or awkward. It was charged with the new, unspoken reality of their relationship. They were husband and wife. The words felt foreign, impossible. Elias glanced at Clara, riding beside him. His wife. He had a wife. The thought was a relentless drumbeat in his mind. He had sought absolute solitude and had ended up with the most profound connection a man could have. Clara felt a bewildering mix of terror and hope. She had tied her life to a man she barely knew, a man who had offered marriage as a legal shield. But she had seen the look in his eyes when he'd kissed her. It was not the look of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation. It was a look of deep, startling emotion, quickly masked, but she had seen it. She had gambled everything on that fleeting glimpse of the man behind the stone-faced mask. When they reached the cabin, the place felt different. It was no longer his cabin that she was visiting. It was their home. The single room seemed smaller, the cot where she had slept an emblem of their strange new intimacy. Elias tended to the horses in a silence that was heavier than before. As dusk fell, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, Elias stood by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. He was waiting. He knew Finch was not the kind of man to be thwarted by a piece of paper he did not respect. The confrontation in town was just the opening salvo. The real battle was yet to come. "He will come tonight," Elias said, his voice flat. He turned from the window, his face grim. "He thinks he can take you. He thinks I'm just some homesteader who will fold under pressure." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze without flinching. "He is wrong." "Yes," Elias said, a flicker of a grim smile touching his lips. He checked the action on his rifle, the metallic click loud in the quiet cabin. He then pulled a second rifle from beneath his bed. It was older, a Spencer carbine from the war. He held it out to her. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Clara looked at the weapon. "My father believed a woman should be educated in all things. He taught me to shoot. It has been a long time. It's like riding a horse. You don't forget," he said, showing her the loading mechanism. "Stay away from the window. Bar the door after me. I'll meet them outside. It's better to have open ground." "You are not facing them alone," she stated, her voice firm. "Clara, this is not a debate," he said, his tone hard. "Your job is to stay safe. My job," she countered, her eyes flashing, "is to be your wife." "In truth," you said, "that means we face this together. I will not hide in here like a frightened rabbit while my husband fights for me. I will fight with you." Elias stared at her, at the fierce determination in her face. This was not the frightened woman he had found in the snow. This was a warrior in her own right. The pride that swelled in his chest was a fierce, powerful thing. He had married a woman made of steel. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right, but you do exactly as I say." They did not have to wait long. Just as the last light bled from the sky, they heard the sound of horses approaching, their hooves muffled by the snow. Elias peered through a small crack in the window shutter. 3 riders. Finch in the lead, flanked by his hired gun from town and another rough-looking man. "Thorn." Finch's voice cut through the cold night air, arrogant and commanding. "Send out my fiancée. I know she's in there. Give her to me, and I might let you live." Elias looked at Clara, his gray eyes communicating 1,000 things he could not say. He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin. "Stay low," he whispered. Then he unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "She's not your fiancée, Finch," Elias called out, his voice calm and carrying. "She's my wife. We were married this afternoon by Sheriff Brody. You have no claim on her." Finch let out a bark of laughter. "A desperate trick. It means nothing. That piece of paper won't stop a bullet." He gestured to his men. "Get her." The two hired guns dismounted, spreading out to flank the cabin, their pistols drawn. The fight happened fast. Elias fired first. His shot aimed not to kill, but to disable. He winged a man on the left, who cried out and dropped his pistol, staggering back. The other man returned fire, the shot splintering the porch post next to Elias's head. Elias dropped to one knee, using a stack of firewood for cover, and fired again. Inside, Clara watched through the crack in the shutter, her heart in her throat. She saw the second hired gun circling around, trying to get a clear shot at Elias from the side. He was focused entirely on Elias, moving stealthily along the wall of the cabin. He was about to have a clear line of fire. Elias was trapped, pinned down by Finch, who was now also firing from his horse. There was no time to think. Clara moved. Kicking the small wooden stool from under the table, she braced the Spencer carbine against the log wall, aimed through a chink between the timbers, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but her shot was true. The hired gun who had been stalking Elias grunted in surprise, clutching his leg as he crumpled to the ground, his pistol falling into the snow. The sudden shot from the cabin startled everyone. In that split second of confusion, Elias moved. He lunged from behind the firewood, closing the distance to the first man he had wounded and disabling him with a swift, brutal blow from the butt of his rifle. Now it was just Finch. Enraged and desperate, Finch spurred his horse forward, drawing a fancy, silver-inlaid pistol and aiming it directly at Elias. "You will not have her," he screamed, his face a contortion of fury. Before he could fire, another sound cut through the night, the thunder of more approaching horses and a voice shouting, "Drop the weapon, Finch." Now, Sheriff Brody and two deputies crested the small rise, their own guns drawn and leveled. Finch was caught, trapped between Elias on the ground and the law behind him. For a moment, he hesitated, his eyes wild, his gun wavering between Elias and the sheriff. It was a moment of pure, venomous indecision. Then, with a final curse, he threw his pistol down in the snow. His gamble had failed. The fight was over. As the sheriff and his men disarmed and arrested a sputtering Alastair Finch and his wounded hired guns, Clara unbarred the door and ran out onto the porch. Elias stood there, his rifle hanging loosely from his hand, watching the scene. He turned as she approached, his face grimy with gunpowder, a splinter of wood in his beard. She stopped in front of him, her hands clenched. "Are you hurt?" "No," he said, his voice rough. He looked at the man, clutching his leg by the side of the cabin. "That was a fine shot. You were in trouble," she said simply. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. His embrace was fierce, desperate, as if he were reassuring himself she was real and safe. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. All the walls he had so carefully constructed, all the defenses against feeling, had been shattered. She had fought for him. She had stood with him. She was his wife. "Clara," he murmured against her hair, the name a prayer. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on just as tightly. In the cold, snow-filled night, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, they held each other, two solitary people who had finally, against all odds, found their way home. The threat was neutralized, the battle won. And in the quiet that followed, a new and far more profound chapter of their lives was just beginning. After Sheriff Brody had hauled Finch and his men away, promising they would face a territorial judge who took a dim view of hired guns and attempted kidnapping, a deep quiet settled over the homestead. The moon rose high, casting the snow-covered landscape in a serene, ethereal light. The air was cold and clean, scrubbed of violence. Inside the cabin, The fire crackled, a cheerful domestic sound that stood in stark contrast to the earlier gunfire. Elias added a log to the flames, the simple, familiar action grounding him. Clara was washing her face and hands in a basin of water, her movements slow and deliberate. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a raw, exposed layer of emotion. Elias turned from the fire and looked at his wife. His wife. The word still felt new and strange on his tongue, yet it also felt like the truest thing in the world. She stood with her back to him, but he could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. The events of the night, of the entire day, were crashing down on her. He crossed the small room and stood behind her. He did not touch her, not yet. "The marriage," he began, his voice low and halting. "I know it was a matter of necessity. The arrangement can be ended. When you're ready to leave for Oregon, I will not stand in your way." He said the words because his honor demanded it. He had offered her a way out, and he had to make it clear that the door was still open. But every word was a betrayal of what his heart now screamed. "Don't go. Stay." Clara stilled, her hands frozen in the water. She slowly turned to face him, her eyes luminous in the firelight. "You called it a business arrangement, Mr. Thorne. A contract to keep me safe." "Elias," he corrected her, his voice rough. "My name is Elias." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Elias, you offer me a marriage in name only. And I refused. I told you I would not live a lie. Has anything changed?" He looked at her, at the strength and vulnerability warring in her expression. He thought of her defiance in the face of Finch, her courage as she held that rifle, the fierce way she had declared herself as partner. She had not just accepted his protection. She had stood and fought beside him. She had saved him. The last of his reservations crumbled to dust. "Everything has changed," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. When I proposed it, I told myself it was for your safety. And it was a lie, too. I didn't want Finch to take you, Clara. Not because of the law, but because I did not want him to have you. Because the thought of you leaving this cabin, of this place going back to the way it was silent and empty, it was more than I could bear. He took a hesitant step closer. "I came here to be alone. I thought solitude was the only cure for what the war did to me. I was wrong. It wasn't a cure. It was just a different kind of death." A slow 1 inch, he finally met her gaze, his own gray eyes stripped of all their defenses. "You walked in out of a blizzard, and you brought me back to life. The marriage proposal wasn't just practical, Clara. It was selfish. I want you to stay, not as part of an arrangement, but as my wife." In truth, tears welled in Clara's eyes and spilled over, tracing shining paths down her cheeks. "Oh, Elias," she whispered. This was the confession she had dreamed of, the hope she had clung to. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "From the moment I woke up in this cabin, I felt safe," she said, her voice trembling. "Even with you being so gruff and silent. I saw the good man you tried so hard to hide. I think I started falling in love with you when you told me about the ghosts you ran from. Because I was running from ghosts, too." He covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused hand engulfing hers. "I love you, Clara," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I don't rightly know what to do with the feeling, but it's there. It's the truest thing I know." She let out a soft, choked sob that was half laughter, half tears. "I love you too, Elias Thorne." He drew her forward, and this time, when he kissed her, it was not a chaste promise. It was a kiss of deep, unrestrained emotion, of gratitude and relief, and a desperate, hungry passion that had been simmering between them for days. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a future. Later, as the fire burned low, Clara rummaged through her small, battered reticule. She pulled out a single, slender tallow candle and a box of matches. It was something she had carried with her from Boston, a small piece of a life that was no more. "What's that?" Elias asked from his chair, watching her. "It's a Christmas tradition," she said softly. "My mother and I, we would always light the first candle on the week before Christmas. To welcome the light into the darkest time of the year, she looked around the rustic, masculine cabin. "I know you dislike the holiday." Elias thought of his earlier pronouncements, his hatred for the season. It had been tied to loneliness, to the absence of family and warmth. It was a reminder of everything he had lost. But looking at Clara, her face illuminated by the match she struck, he realized it was not the holiday he hated. It was the emptiness. She lit the candle and placed it on the rough mantelpiece. It was a tiny flame, a fragile speck of light, but it pushed back the shadows in the corners of the cabin, its glow warm and golden. The light danced in her eyes, reflecting a future he had never dared to dream of. "I hated it," he said, his voice quiet, "because it was a time for family, and I had no one." It was a celebration of light in a life that felt full of darkness. He stood and walked to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stared at the small, brave flame together. "It looks different now." The single candle, a beacon of hope she had carried with her out of the storm, did what no amount of time or solitude could. It lit the last dark corner of his heart and melted the ice that had encased it for so long. He was home. 5 years later. The cabin was no longer a single room. A new wing, built with the same sturdy pine and Elias's now practiced hands, had been added. It housed a spacious bedroom and another small room, currently filled with shelves of books and a child's small bed. The homestead was no longer a solitary outpost, but a thriving ranch. The herd of cattle had grown, and a large, fenced-in pasture held a dozen fine horses. It was a week before Christmas. Snow lay thick and perfect on the ground, blanketing the world in a peaceful silence. Inside the cabin, however, it was anything but silent. The air was filled with warmth, the scent of gingerbread, and the sound of child's laughter. Elias stood in the doorway, stamping the snow from his boots. He watched the scene before him, a familiar, powerful sense of love and contentment washing over him. Clara, her honey-blonde hair pinned up, a light dusting of flour on her cheek, was lifting their 4-year-old son, James, up to place a carved wooden star on top of a small fir tree in the corner. "Higher, Mama, higher," Jamie squealed, his small hands carefully guiding the star. "All right, my little man, there we go," Clara said, her voice full of laughter. She settled him back on the floor and turned, her eyes finding Elias in the doorway. Her smile was the warmest thing in the room. Her pregnancy was just beginning to show, a gentle curve beneath her apron. Elias's heart clenched with a love so fierce it almost hurt. He crossed the room and kissed her, a deep, familiar kiss that still held the magic of the first. He rested his hand on her stomach. "How are my two best girls?" he murmured. He had a feeling about this one. "We are wonderful," she whispered back, leaning into his strength. "And hungry. Jamie and I have declared it a gingerbread for dinner night." "A fine declaration," Elias said, swinging his son up into his arms. Jamie smelled of pine needles and sugar. His eyes, the same clear gray as his father's, shone with excitement. Later that evening, after Jamie was asleep in his bed, Elias and Clara sat before the fire. The tree, decorated with an assortment of carved wooden animals Elias had made, strings of dried berries, and Jamie's clumsy paper creations, glowed in the corner. A whole row of candles now stood on the mantel, their flames dancing. Clara had not just brought light into his life, she had brought learning. 3 days a week, their main room was transformed into a one-room schoolhouse. Children from the 3 other homesteads that had sprung up in the valley would ride in, and Clara would teach them to read, write, and cipher. His resilient Boston lady had found her purpose, not in Oregon, but right here. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, his hand resting on the small swell of their future. "Do you remember that first night?" she asked softly. "When you told me you hated Christmas?" Elias looked at the tree, at the candles, at the warmth and life that filled his home. He thought of the man he had been, a ghost haunting an empty cabin, a man who believed survival meant being alone. He had been so wrong. True survival, true strength, was not found in solitude. It was found here, in the circle of his wife's arms, in the sound of his son's breathing, in the promise of the new life they had created together. "I remember a fool who didn't know he was freezing to death," Elias said, his voice a low, contented rumble. He tightened his embrace, pulling her closer, until an angel got lost in a blizzard and lit a candle to show him the way home.